Hello, everybody. Welcome to Find a Cure's webinar today, all about building an international patient registry. Hopefully you can all hear me loud and clearly, and possibly see me on the webcam as well. For those that don't know me, my name is Rick. I am CEO at Find a Cure, and I'm joined today by Phil Norman, our newest team member, and our two presenters, Femida and Joe, who will introduce properly very shortly. So yeah, today's webinar is a continuation of Find a Cure's ongoing patient empowerment program and a follow-up to a workshop that we ran earlier last year, focusing on registries as a strategy for rare disease patient groups. So to get started, I'll just show our faces. Like I say, my name is Rick, CEO of Find a Cure. This is Phil, who's going to be probably taking charge of the webinar program moving forward, so a face you'll hopefully be increasingly familiar with. And the reason we're here today is the reason we're at all Find a Cure events is because of rare diseases and the challenge that they pose globally. I won't dwell too long on this because we've got a very focused audience who know all about the challenges of rare diseases, but suffice to say, rare diseases affect a huge number of people globally. It's estimated to be about 3.5 million people in the UK, 350 million people worldwide. And despite the huge diversity of symptoms that people live with and the ways that they affect people on a day-to-day, there are a huge amount of commonalities between the lived experience of patients with rare conditions. And those tie into some of the things that this slide shows. The diagnostic odyssey, the challenges in accessing proper education or access to work, the high mortality rate for young children, and of course, the really low number of available treatments. Because of that shared experience, though, we do have this commonality, if you like, in the presence of a really informed, active patient population, which is you guys, with the power and determination to deliver change for themselves. And registries are obviously one way that we can do that. Find a Cure as an organisation is a UK-based charity that's hopefully out there to try and help rare disease patient groups, to help them grow, to help them really achieve their full potential. We have a simple vision, which is a world in which all rare diseases have treatments that have been made together with patients for patients. And we really believe that by bringing patients together into collaborative projects, we can accelerate treatment development for everybody. What we do as an organisation, firstly, is focus on empowering patient groups, giving them the skills they need to be the most effective they can be, ideally to help them in growing their patient organisation and providing support to the patients themselves. And secondly, we want to build an active and vibrant rare disease community where people in patient groups can communicate with people in the private sector, whether that be in pharma, academic research, biotechs, so that everyone who can really move things forward is connected and can make a big impact on the lives of rare disease patients. So today's webinar is all about our empowerment scheme. It's about finding ways to help patients move forward. And empowering can occasionally sound like a bit of a buzzword. What we're trying to do basically is these four major things: to help patient groups build a charity, to help them find ways to support patients and families who live with their rare condition, and hopefully to help them raise awareness about their condition. And today's webinar is very much in that fourth bucket, in helping to find ways to get patients ready to engage in research, to collect information and to make the most of the information that they have, so they can drive towards a treatment for their condition. This project is supported firstly by the National Lottery Community Fund here in the UK, so I want to thank them for their help. And we're now going to dive into the presentations itself, and I'm going to hand over to Philippa, who's going to give you a bit of introduction to today's topic.
Hello everyone, as Rick said, I'm just going to shed some light on the context why we've decided to film this webinar on international registries. So Pulse Infoframe actually helped us with the strategy and key approaches to delivering our September workshop on building a registry, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to further that expertise and to further the experiences they can share with us on international registries and shed some light on some of the challenges that come with having a registry, but also some of the opportunities that register can bring to your patient group. And registries are a very important topic for a lot of patient groups because they bring a myriad of ways that you can use information, utilise information, as you'll find out later in the webinar, and yet they're quite a complex topic and something that's not always easy to get into or to understand, so having them explained in this way can be really helpful. And in rare diseases, registries are very important, especially international registries, as often it's hard to find rare disease patients, and registries allow us to kind of expand beyond national borders and help us deliver meaningful change on a bigger scale. So that's why we've chosen to focus on the international element. So without further ado, I would love to pass over to our two speakers from Pulse Infoframe today, and that is Dr. Femida Gwadry-Sridha and Joe Ternullo.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to first make sure you can all hear me. I'm assuming the answer to that question is yes. My name is Joe Ternullo, and I am with Pulse Infoframe. And first, I want to thank Philippa and Rick and all of our friends and colleagues at Find a Cure. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you who have tuned in to the webinar today. We realize that you're busy. We understand this is a capacity crowd. We've prepared a webinar that we think is chock full of information that we hope is valuable to you. And so we've organized this presentation into various focus areas. We're going to start with introductions, learning objectives, and the agenda. And so first, introductions. Dr. Femida Gwadry-Sridha, who is the founder and CEO of Pulse Infoframe, will be presenting. And my name, as I said, is Joe Ternullo. I oversee business development for Pulse Infoframe. Femida, would you like to say a few words now?
Sure, happy to do that. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Joe mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Pulse Infoframe, and we are a company that has built a platform technology to collect data that is relevant in rare disease and cancer globally, and worked very closely with the regulators to do that. But the main way that I can explain this will come through the slides that we're going to go through. My own background is on the slides, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but only to reiterate that we're very pleased to be here today. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Femida. Okay, and so here you see my bio on the screen. I've had the privilege to work with Femida and Pulse for the past 5 years, and for me, the draw is obvious. The deep, mission-driven commitment, the specialized domain knowledge, and the opportunity to meet unmet need and improve lives. And for me, there's simply no better motivation than to help others. And that is exactly what Pulse Infoframe does, as you will see in the coming slides. And so this is a 90-minute webinar, and we think that we'll have about an hour presentation and then probably 20 minutes or so of question and answers, and then wrap up. We've set what we believe are achievable learning objectives that are worthy of your time and that make for an informative presentation. You can see them here. And here is the agenda. You'll see that we have 9 focus areas. Good news, we have just concluded the first one. And with that, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Femida to take us through the Pulse Infoframe overview slides.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Joe, for the introduction. I thought it might be helpful for us to kind of think about what we should be looking for when we're considering a rare disease registry. And first of all, what do we mean by a registry? I think people use the word in many different ways. And essentially, when we talk about a registry, we're talking about information that is collected that is both produced and provided by patients, so what we call a patient registry, but can include natural history and can also include clinical data. Now, essentially, if you see the first curve, it says that a registry should have the ability to grow with you. And so if you think about many registries, what happens sometimes in patient advocacy groups is that a contact registry is first created. So let's think about that as the first block on the bottom left. And over time, we decide that we want to collect more data. And so we collect patient data, we also collect natural history data, and eventually then we can grow up in collecting the additional clinical data that we require. So the reason I think this is important is that sometimes people get very focused on doing everything on the same day. And there's really no need to do that. What you really want to think about is, what do I need today? What are the endpoints and information that's critical for today? Is it to grow a community? Or is there an opportunity to grow more data and to collect more data because drugs are being developed? So just keep that in the back of your mind that you don't have to do everything on day one. The second thing is really rare disease patients are everywhere in the world. And so dealing in this area, it's really important to think about both the privacy and the security requirements that are now necessary based on GDPR and other legislation. So when you think about a registry, think about being able to get international coverage because your colleagues and peers and other patients are all over the world. Information has to be kept safe. So I'm in San Francisco, as Joe mentioned, attending a number of healthcare meetings and conferences, and this is really a big topic of discussion. It's really around, are there ways to actually keep your data safe, but still make it usable? Because the flip side is, if you're providing data and nobody's using it, then what's the point? And there are many different ways to keep data safe, and we'll talk about that, but those are questions that you should be asking. And there's a lot of complexity with the knowledge that's required today around the laws and regulations around storing patient information. So I use the word GDPR, which is the data protection requirements in the UK. There's HIPAA in the US. There's some countries that don't allow data to be shared with other countries, etc. So please, think about that when you're thinking about your registries. And a registry is not simply a piece of software. It is really the knowledge that goes around building these registries requires deep knowledge in science and medicine. Because if you don't have that, if you're not working with partners, your clinical partners, your technology partners, people who actually know what needs to be collected and how it should be collected, then you're at a disadvantage. What do we mean by keeping your data clean? Often people collect data, and which is great. It's a great starting point. But after that, the question is, how are you actually collecting it? Does it require a lot of cleanup in the back? And if you have to keep cleaning the data, it puts the data at risk. In other words, you don't know about the integrity of the data. So you also want to be able to think about the partner that you choose to help build your registry, whoever it is. You want to be able to work with them. You need to make sure that they understand what your goals are, and you want to make sure that the data that is being collected, in the event that you want to be able to use it in the future, is going to be there for you to be able to use, because it's a big investment in time and effort to collect data. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just talking to you about why Pulse was formed and what our vision is and what we do. If you think about the healthcare data ecosystem, all of the groups, patients, advocacy groups, providers and researchers and pharmaceutical companies are all collecting data. If you think about how those data come together, it's not always evident. And sometimes we're all collecting the same data. And so think about a world where you're actually identifying the data that needs to be collected in the beginning, that you're working collectively and collaboratively to be able to establish what data are important for which of the constituents, and that essentially you're going to create a mechanism for you to share those data. So what Pulse Infoframe has done is essentially leveraged our deep clinical and data science expertise and organize these data and bring people together in a way that we can establish appropriate ways to, first of all, identify the key data that are important for each of those constituents, because we all have different data needs. And ultimately then, to put the data into a platform that is mapped in a way that makes it easy to utilize the data. And so our vision is really to build collaborative networks, because if we don't do that, particularly in rare disease, it's going to be very difficult for us to advance cure. And I know that we all have that mission to advance cure. We really believe, based on what we've done, that we are leaders in this field. But the critical thing is really that we want to be able to share data across boundaries. Again, with the sole purpose that if we don't, we won't be able to actually make the meaningful medical advances with all of the stakeholders. If one benefits and others don't, that's really not, appreciable benefit to society. From a technology perspective, think about the sources of data that are currently available. So in the first slide, I showed you that you could have a patient, patient contact registry and eventually grow into a larger registry. The way we look at the data world is as follows. There are data that already exists that people are collecting, whether it's an electronic health record, lab data, genomics data, big data, wearable data. Everybody's got a phone. Information is being collected all the time. But in rare disease, those data elements don't fully represent or characterize the disease. So essentially what we think about is, what are the unique data that are important in the specific diseases within which we are working? And to do that, we call that the unique data. We worked with the Office of Rare Disease initially, many, many years ago, identifying common data elements. So there are lots of data elements that are actually common across rare diseases. And so what we do is we characterize the common data elements, and then working with the patients, with the clinicians, and systematically reviewing the literature, we identify what we know about a particular disease and codify those data elements. And what that means essentially is that each of us are actually different people. And in rare disease, it's even more complicated because there's so many differences both within and across patients within a particular rare disease. So the art here is really being able to identify those unique data. The second unique data come directly from patients. So what are the patient-reported outcome measures that are important for those patients? Because sometimes what's clinically important, where we characterize data that we're interested in, doesn't really have relevance for a patient. And so more and more, the regulators in particular are willing to accept and understand that there are unique data that are important for patients. So let me give you a concrete example. In patients with muscular dystrophy, one of the clinical parameters that people measure is a 6-minute walk test, where people have to walk for 6 minutes or as long as they can, and there are measures that are used to characterize how successful that walk test is. But for patients, that's not what their daily life looks like. When you talk to patients, they want to be able to get out of a wheelchair or potentially walk or dress themselves. And so being able to characterize on both sides of that, what's clinically important and what's important for a patient, actually helps us better understand how a drug is going to impact on a patient. So what we have done is created a platform that allows us to capture, organize, analyze, curate, and share the data in a way that is going to be important to all of the constituents in that data ecosystem we showed you. And then think about, what do I want this data to be able to do? We believe that by doing this in an appropriate way, we should all be thinking about how the data can be used. Does it provide better access to clinical trials because we have high quality data in a particular disease? Do patients, because they're part of a network, are they able to provide input on trial design? Because that's very important. And the example I used in muscular dystrophy is one way to think about that. Does it allow us to grow a broader clinical network? Are we able to look at more new treatments being developed because the correct information is being collected? And ultimately, even if drugs are developed and they're approved, who's going to pay for them? So collecting the right data to facilitate pricing reimbursement. Now, this does not mean that you have to think about all of this on day one, but keep your eye to how you want to grow, and then think about ultimately how you want the data to be used. Mostly, we're looking for data to be created that are ultimately going to be helpful in bringing drugs to market, and in encouraging pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies to be interested in developing treatments for diseases. And the way that we think of this world of data and of registries is very similar to how you build a house. If you build a house for every single rare disease, it's expensive and it's complicated when you're trying to learn what's in the house next door. And so as a platform, what we've done is essentially laid the foundation so that every rare disease have their own room, but on the same foundation. So ultimately, you can look across diseases and try to understand what's common and to learn from other diseases so that we can improve our learnings in a particular disease. So what do we know about rare and orphan diseases? We know that 1 in 10 people are affected. There are at least 7,000 rare diseases we know of. That 3 of 10 children with a rare disease won't live to see their 5th birthday. And it takes rare patients 8 years on average to receive a diagnosis. And 95% of rare diseases lack FDA or EMA approved treatment. This we know. And what we need to do, our challenge and our call to action, is really to change this. So there have been some great advances that are benefiting the rare disease community. And one of the advances is really what the regulators have actually helped us collectively as a community think about registries and the real world data that comes out of registries. In December 2018, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who was at the FDA, issued a real world evidence program. And as part of that, focused on the importance of being able to collect high quality data that can ultimately be used to advance drug development. This is an important consideration in the rare disease community. Because if we think about treatment, if we think about how we actually determine whether or not a drug is going to work, we generally will conduct what we call randomized controlled trials, where we're comparing one drug to another drug or one drug to placebo. The reality in rare diseases is that there aren't enough patients to be able to do that, because if we tried to do that, we would need larger numbers of patients. There's a recognition then that there may be other ways to actually achieve identifying whether or not a therapy is working. And so what Dr. Gottlieb suggested is that if you're collecting high quality real world data, which is essentially a registry, and those data are codified and collected in a way that can be utilized by the regulators, in other words, high quality curated data, that they were willing to consider that those data could actually be the starting point for establishing whether or not a drug will work. And what that means essentially is that patients who are part of a registry would provide data into that registry, and then when a new therapy became available, they could cross over into a treatment arm if they were eligible. That allows us to compress the time that is required to actually conduct a trial and reduce the number of patients that would be required. So that, we believe, has been a fundamental shift in the mentality and the approach that regulators are taking. It's not where we still want it to be, but what is clearly needed is that when people think about registries, think carefully about the quality of the data, the usability of the data, and ask the questions about whether you believe the regulatory agencies would be willing to actually utilize the data. So the quality of data is key, and also consider the multiple sources of data, which will sometimes challenge the quality of the data. And so all of these areas are really things that we should be thinking about when we're building a registry. So this is a very, very busy slide, but let's take a look at parts of this and really try to think about, what the world can look like in the world of registries and what it really means for patients. So the way that we think about registries is essentially they have to be there to engage patients. And we believe strongly that, if patients are providing data, they have to be able to get feedback, have dashboards and information that are going to allow patients to actually understand the value of what they're providing into the registry. So the real world data, the way we characterize it, just to reiterate, is patient data, the lab diagnostic data, and the specific data that need to be collected in that particular disease. Ultimately, we want the data to be usable. So you need to be able to conduct analytics. We need the data to be utilized for the regulatory agencies. So that's regulatory data. And remember that data ecosystem, we had patients, advocacy, we had physicians and researchers in pharma and biotech, those are the collaboration portals, where within each of those groups there has to be a mechanism for people to collaborate and to share data. And the sharing of data has become a very complex issue, because people are always concerned about the form within which data are being shared. By properly managing the data, de-identifying it, and protecting the security and the privacy of the data, there are mechanisms that are available to share the data in a de-identified way so that researchers can interrogate the data, so that pharmaceutical companies can better understand the natural history of the disease, and so that patients can also share data and have a better understanding of the impact and the future impact of the disease on the patients. And ultimately, the Holy Grail is the ability to actually conduct clinical trials. Clinical trials are also something where in a platform or in a registry, you need to make sure that you're thinking about the appropriate consenting mechanisms and information that patients have to be provided with. And we believe that that information has to be fully transparent. So again, as you're thinking about registries, and not to make this really complicated for you, think about all of these issues. How are people going to understand how the data are being used? How will you have a say in how the data are being used? And how are we actually providing a letter of information and consents to patients in an understandable way? So this slide essentially reiterates what I talked about in terms of the foundation and how we build on a foundation. And so again, the beauty of having a platform or being able to work with people who actually are able to learn from other diseases, what we call a learning platform, is that essentially you're also reducing your costs when you do that, because you're not building what we call the house from the ground up. You're able to leverage what other people have done, and you're also able to be in a community where you can share information with one another. Sharing information doesn't mean you're sharing data necessarily, although there are ways to do that. But ultimately, also what's very important is that researchers are able to look across diseases and really try to get better characterization of those diseases. So one of the ways that the regulators, particularly the FDA, recommends that data are collected are in a standardized way, which it's called OMOP, and that's the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, which essentially codifies every single data variable. And by that I mean, in the past, for example, let's say somebody said, I have high blood pressure, and somebody else said, I have hypertension. High blood pressure and hypertension are exactly the same, maybe with different manifestations, but then we would generally write some mapping algorithms to say high blood pressure equals hypertension. But because of the complexity of the data that are being collected, there's a lot of room for error there. And so essentially the OMOP is an umbrella of common data elements where we can map each variable into that common data element. So it already has a code assigned to it. And that code ensures that there is standardization. And why is that important to you? Because the standardization is what is ultimately going to create higher quality data, which requires less manual machination in the future. And so by being able to do that, and also being able to provide the data potentially to the regulators, and potentially also working with other collaborators for drug development, actually helps advance the ability and the time frame to be able to at least look at curative treatments. And particularly where we look at precision medicine, this becomes a very important consideration. Yesterday, I was on a panel with a number of international people, including people from the World Economic Forum, where we actually discussed this very point. And it was the point of standardization of data. Because let's say you have another advocacy group or another patient group that are also collecting data, and you want to be able to share your knowledge, and they all have the same disease or a variant of the disease. Unless the data are mapped in a way that are shareable, ultimately, it becomes far more complex. And given that every single patient is different, and we're seeing a big push into precision medicine, where treatments are being developed and being provided on the basis of the genetic sequencing in a particular individual, the quality and the standardization of data is also really important if we're moving in that direction. And over to you now, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Femida. So Femida presented several slides on the Pulse Infoframe registry platform, and interspersed in that discussion regulatory and global standard underpinnings that are built into the system. And so because there was so much thrown at you in such a brief period of time, we thought it might make sense over the next 3 slides to recap some of the important points in that area. We'll have another opportunity to do this later during the question and answer period. So the Pulse platform is mapped to the OMOP standard. As Femida mentioned, this is Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership data standard. It's a global standard. The FDA and other regulatory bodies were associated with that, and various pharmaceutical companies and major providers of healthcare services. And so, in essence, what this is all about is enriching the data and transforming it so that no matter where it comes from, it's in a common format and common representation so that the data can be analyzed efficiently and insights can occur. And as you see here, the first bullet, this extends not merely to clinical data, does hypertension mean high blood pressure, but to patient-reported outcome measures as well. The patient is the most underutilized resource in healthcare. With the Pulse platform, the voice of the patient is rising. And it's rising even further because everything in the registry is mapped to the OMOP standard. No matter where the input is coming from, which country, which is especially important in rare diseases because patients are with the population of interest is scattered around the world, and no matter where the information is coming from, it's mapped in this platform to a common standard. You also see reference to 21 CRF Part 11. I just wanted to point out that this is also a regulatory standard, and it is intended to provide assurance that electronic records and electronic signatures are as accurate, reliable, and authentic as paper records and handwritten signatures. And the Pulse platform fully adheres to that requirement as well. And finally, on this slide, what you see is a reference to CDISC. And what CDISC is a globally accepted standard for providing or submitting data to federal regulators. It has to be delivered in a manner that they adhere to. This is the CDISC standard, different but similar in some respects to OMOP in that it's a global data standard. And again, the Pulse Infoframe platform is built to ensure compliance with the CDISC standard. Again, especially important in the case of rare disease. And I'm going to go to the next slide unless you have anything to add, Femida.
No, that's great. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, thank you. And so here again, we're talking about OMOP and tying it to real world data, and the FDA, the EMA, and the regulatory standards really globally, not just the US and in the EU. I mentioned that the data is readable in CDISC, which is the global standard, and this is critical for pricing and reimbursement. It's critical for innovative clinical trial designs, which Femida alluded to earlier, for grant applications, for abstracts, posters, etc. And fundamentally, what you have in a registry that adheres to these standards is you're able to, you might say in many cases for the first time, collect data and form a critical mass of information on the population of interest, on the disease that you're studying, so that we can whittle down. Earlier, Femida had mentioned that over 7,000 rare diseases, 95% of those rare diseases do not have FDA-approved treatment. And what we're looking to do through a registry built to these standards is help to advance science and improve lives. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Femida.
So when we think about building a registry, we obviously think about our ecosystem within which we are. And as I mentioned previously, many patients are all over the world. And I thought that maybe one way to kind of talk a little bit about an international registry, which sometimes can seem quite overwhelming in the beginning, is to maybe that we can provide you with some cases and some case studies. So several years ago, we're still working with the Orphan Disease Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and we have provided our platform to them to support a number of rare diseases. One of those diseases is what called CDKL5, and CDKL5 is a rare pediatric neurological disease which has a number of genetic anomalies. At the time that this registry was first built, there were really no organized data in a codified way. Certainly people were collecting data and they were trying to progress treatment. But what we discovered was that for some of the trials that were being done, as an example, there was a trial that was attempted where it took 2 years in Europe to collect the data from 15 people, so 2 years to recruit 15 people. And ultimately, when the data were provided to the regulators, they rejected the data from 10 of those patients for that particular trial. And that's really heartbreaking, because what that means is that 15 people in good faith provided data, had access to early treatment, but yet the data was not considered to be of high enough quality and didn't include some of the data variables that were important to patients. So subsequently, what we did was we built a platform to support CDKL5. Now, when we're looking at CDKL5, so many patients now are on that platform, and where there were no treatments, no drugs other than the one that I discussed that were in development, there are now 4 companies actually doing research and have developed molecules that are already in trials, some of which are in phase 2 trials. And because there's higher quality data available and a clear line of sight that we also have been able to characterize more and more of the natural history in CDKL5, this has resulted in much greater interest in this particular disease. Now, CDKL5 patients come from all over the world, and there are also a number of advocacy groups who are involved in CDKL5 research. And so one of the tricks here then is to also try to figure out, or one of the challenges is, if there are different groups collecting data, how do we actually ensure that the data that are being collected are harmonized? Because what we don't want to do is also create a situation where patient groups are fractured, because it doesn't really help anybody. And so what we did was we were able to work with the 2 advocacy groups, the large groups, and come up with a memorandum of understanding that both groups were willing and able to share the data with one another, and furthermore to reduce the duplication of data that would have otherwise been created. So essentially, that was the case study I wanted to share, that there are patients that all over the world, some of which are coming into the CDKL5 registry at the University of Pennsylvania, some of whom are going into another registry, and ultimately you have to build a bridge. But most importantly, because now we're collecting high quality data, there has been a much better opportunity to have treatment because the natural history of the data of the patients are being characterized in a way that are useful to the drug developers. So keep in mind, when we first started, we talked about a contact registry. A contact registry essentially just allows us to make contact and make sure that we know where the patients are. The next step is really then to characterize the natural history. And unfortunately, characterizing natural history in rare diseases, it is not simple, because every single rare disease has a different natural history, and every patient has a different patient journey. So being able to characterize the journey of those patients, which is essentially the natural history, and being able to codify it so that the regulators will understand that, yes, not every patient is going to have the same outcome in a treatment, but if we understand the variation, we know which patients are going to benefit more. And so as new molecules are developed, we're able to characterize what the molecule should be able to do in a patient who maybe didn't respond to a different treatment. Some of you may have heard of Castleman's disease, and David Fajgenbaum has just written a book called Chasing My Cure. And this is very, very interesting. If you don't know the story, it might be worth just looking it up in your free time. So David is actually a physician, and he was in medical school at the time that he was admitted to the hospital, and ended up in the intensive care unit for several months. And on his website, there's his story is also there. So essentially, he was in the hospital and nobody could make a diagnosis because nobody really knew what he had. And he actually died several times, but he didn't. Fortunately, he survived. The one thing he said was, if I survive, I'm going to start a registry. I'm going to share information about my disease so that more people can actually be treated. And this is a very complex disease because essentially it does cause a fair bit of debilitation, but the causes can be very different. So there isn't a single cause. There are many causes that result in Castleman's disease. Now, we had to be creative about how data came into the registry. Patients in the United States will often go to large academic treatment centers like the University of Pennsylvania for their treatment, but they don't necessarily live in Pennsylvania. They live in other states. And it wouldn't be fair to ask patients to come to the hospital just to provide data. And so what we did was we created a system that essentially allows patients to provide data from wherever they are and to be able to share their entire health record into the registry. So this reduces the burden on the patient, but yet really important information is being provided from their health record to the Castleman's network that they then go through and codify. And that has now resulted in the opportunity for treatment and new molecules or molecules that were not previously used, like interleukin-6 in this disease. Now in Europe, the situation is slightly different because there's several hospitals that treat patients with Castleman's disease. So what we did in Europe was we actually had 10 clinical sites where patients are seen. So those patients, their data are being entered by the clinical sites or the doctors and their delegates. And in the US, data are coming in from everywhere in the country. And that will be the same model that's used globally. So having the flexibility to think about, the cumbersome nature of data entry, the time it takes to enter the data, where do I have to go to enter the data? All of these are important considerations. And so this is a really interesting case study, and I do encourage you to read about his story because it's so compelling. So this is really in UvealMelanoma. So UvealMelanoma is an ocular melanoma where people develop a melanoma essentially in their eye, and it's quite devastating. So essentially here, in this particular melanoma, these patients are ultra rare, and being able to find these patients is very difficult. And so what we did was we created what we call a hub and spoke model, where each country has a hub. So in the United States, it's Dr. Carhaval. In Columbia University. In the UK, it's Dr. Sacco at Liverpool. and then in Australia it's Dr. Joshua. And so by being able to be creative about thinking about where does the data come from and how do we actually collect it in a way that we can still share the data, but make sure that the data within each country has the integrity and meets the privacy and security requirements of that country. So this is something also that the World Economic Forum is working on, and this is a distributed data system where essentially each country collects their own data, but yet the de-identified data can be utilized for research. And now there's drug development. So Immunocore in this particular case was the initial funder of the registry, but there are many other people who will come in to help support it. And that's the other thing to think about. Sometimes when you're building a registry, there's you have to think about, you know, the sustainability, the feasibility, the costs. But you also don't necessarily want to build a drug registry, because if it's only for one company or one drug, it doesn't benefit all the other companies that may have drugs in development. And so our model is really to build an ecosystem, to have, whether it's an advocacy group doing the funding or start out with a single company that has a need for the data for a regulatory purpose, but then add in others. And so remember to have that flexibility before you actually contribute your data into a registry. Think about the sustainability, think about the ability to bring in other partners, and make sure that you have the flexibility to do that in the future. I wanted to show you, this is a very advanced registry that we have been working on for the last 10 years, and it's in melanoma. When this registry was first started, it was in 2010, and now it's across 13 major cancer centers and has a very, very deep data that has been utilized for many different reasons. And I thought this might kind of give you a view of, you know, the world that can open up when you're collecting data and you have a highly organized registry. So in this registry, we collect information about the care, treatment outcomes. It's real world data. And initially, prior to 2010, there were really no treatments in melanoma. And with the advances now in immunotherapy, in very, very specific targeted treatments, we're now able to learn a lot more about the disease, and there are more treatments, incredible number of treatments available. So in this registry, the data that are being collected are looking at actually whether or not the drugs that are being used in real life have the same benefits that were seen in clinical trial. And why is this important? Because sometimes the patients who are recruited into clinical trials don't always represent the patients in entirety, because every patient has a slightly different natural history. What we discovered was that some of the drugs that were being used have a very high toxicity in melanoma, or in other cancers also, but are also highly effective. But in patients who did not respond, if they received treatment and they didn't respond, their immune system was not able to take on any new treatment after that. So that's a challenge, right? So based on the real world data, the researchers were able to think about switching the sequencing of treatment so that patients who had the appropriate gene received a different treatment, and if they didn't respond, they were able to go to the treatment that was a little more toxic, but at least they had something to go to. So again, this is really to illustrate the value of having real world data, because it helps you establish the effectiveness compared to what it might have looked like in a clinical trial. And the type of research that occurs and the information that's being collected has also helped support reimbursement of some of these expensive treatments. So in the UK, you've got NICE, every country have their own sort of board that looks at, you know, the quality of life impact of a particular treatment and establishes the cost effectiveness of those treatments. And so that's where, you know, the melanoma patients were able to benefit from having high quality data. And ultimately, there is a whole life cycle of what data can do and what it can be used for. So when you think about the world of registries and data, also think about not just what your needs are today, but what are you going to think about in the future. And as I mentioned very early in the presentation, having a drug that's available doesn't mean people are going to pay for it. So That's why collecting quality of life information, establishing cost effectiveness analyses are all very important, and those data come from registries.
Okay, thank you, Femida. This is an interesting segment of our presentation. What we wanted to do is provide some key considerations on what to think about when planning a registry. And the way we did this is we distilled it to 11 points. And the format that we're going to use for this particular segment is I'm going to read a couple of the points, pause, and Femida will contribute her thinking around them. This might help with some questions for the Q&A section, and feel free to begin putting them into the chat box. So let me get started on the key considerations. So the first two, and then I'll pause after that, that we thought was important was when you're planning a registry, start with articulating the purpose of the registry, and then ask, is a registry the most important method to achieve your purpose? Femida, do you want to comment on those two?
No, not right now. I think you've, essentially, I think what it comes to, well, maybe I will comment then, the endpoints. What do I want to do with the data? Sometimes we collect data, and remember, every time we collect data, it takes time and it takes money. So the analogy I use is, look, if I go to a grocery store and I have a shelf full of all these wonderful things in front of me, and I think about taking them all, but I still don't know what I'm going to make with them, that's sort of a waste. And so think about, what is it that I want? What are the endpoints that are important? And ultimately, how do I want to be able to use the data? And that's what you should really be thinking about. Are the data for just to understand more about the disease? Are there specific endpoints that are going to be very important in this particular condition? And of course, you would be working with your clinical colleagues to help establish that there are endpoints that are important from your perspective. So think about that as something that you want to be able to have at the end of this.
Thank you, Femida. Thank you. Okay, so then from there, we move to some primary research. You'll want to do a literature search and a search of clinical trials that are out there. And the reason you want to do that is you want to identify the key stakeholders, the clinical opinion leaders, the centers of excellence, the leading researchers, the advocates in those pharmaceutical, biotech, or med device companies with a clinical pipeline of interest to you and the population that you're looking to help. And at the same time, now you've gone a fair amount into this. You want to determine the feasibility of the registry. Will it affect change, the change that you're looking for? Will it achieve goal? And will the registry be sustainable, at least insofar as it meets your purpose in going down this path? So I'm going to pause there and invite Femida to comment.
That was well said, Joe. Why don't you keep going? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And so next, I'm going to go through the next two and then pause. So from there, you'll want to identify and build a registry team, assuming that the fourth item, determining the feasibility, is yes, we want to go down this path. This is going to achieve goal. You need to identify and build a registry team. You need to establish registry governance, a scientific oversight committee. We haven't talked much about that in this presentation so far. Pulse has extensive experience. Femida, this is really her career. And Femida, do you want to talk on registry governance, structure, and scientific oversight?
Right? So people collect data, and then sometimes what we find is that people are less willing to share data if they don't know how it's going to be used. And so when I use the Castleman's disease example, but I didn't tell you one thing, and that was that the people who were collecting data in Castleman's disease had not shared their data with anybody. They were holding this knowledge and information to themselves. They'd maybe published 2 papers in a number of years. And so by not sharing the information with the community, we had no line of sight into what appropriate treatment may be, at least to deal with the symptoms, even if it wasn't to cure. So a governance structure really creates a transparency, which is very important. That means that essentially when people contribute data, patients know that there is a process in place to manage the data, to request data, that it won't just be held by one person who isn't going to share the data, or two people. It doesn't matter whether it's a clinician, researcher, advocacy group. It's really important to think about the structure that you want, because ultimately it really has to line up with the goals that you have for that registry. So the way that we build governance structures is really around, we put in place a scientific advisory board, because these are the people who know the science, the people who understand the disease. And on that scientific advisory board, there should always be a patient representative. And then we have a steering committee, and the steering committee is more around governance and really understanding what the registry needs to be able to do in the future, and also making sure that the data that are being collected are relevant, not from a scientific perspective, but relevant for the end goals of that particular advocacy group and that particular disease. So that's what registry governance is around. And if you don't have that, what we find is that, especially academic sites and researchers, because they are interested in a particular disease, but also are interested in publishing. And if there is no clear structure for them to be able to share data with one another and to equalize it so that everybody has the same benefit and it's not in just one person's hands, then it becomes far more difficult to actually get the data that's required in a particular registry. Thank you, Joe.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go through the next two, and then we'll pause again. And so at this point, what you want to do, you're fairly far along. You want to, and this is all in the planning phase, mind you, you want to define the registry scope and the level of rigor and resources necessary to achieve mission. As Femida pointed out earlier, and you well know, this is a resource-constrained environment, so you want to use your resources very judiciously so that you don't overbuy, over-collect, and or at the same token, underbuy and under-collect and fall short of mission. Now, along those lines, what you want to do is clarify the data dictionary needs. We haven't spoken very extensively about data dictionaries. They are critical underpinnings of registries. We also spoke briefly, you want to identify the patient outcome and experience measures that you're planning. You want to clarify the target population of interest, and importantly, understand where they congregate and how do you not only find them, but engage them. Femida, do you want to speak on those couple points?
And so the point here that I think is really important is that, you know, sometimes patients are part of Facebook groups, or they may be part of other communities. And so think about, you know, how you're going to bring people together and what your plan is, whether you're going to use social media, whether you're going to, you know, reach out specifically to specific groups, because ultimately what you want is to be able to make sure that you have a network that are sharing data. And so we have a process that we use that I won't discuss in detail here, and I'm sure many of you have mechanisms that you use. But think about all of the planning before you hit go, because once you start and you haven't thought about how am I going to bring people on, how am I going to talk about the registry, what are the questions that people are going to have about joining, there's a planning process which is very different, but parallel and important, as Joe had said, to the actual building of the registry. I think you can go through the rest of them, Joe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to mention this next one. Understand the data, where it comes from, and ensure that the data is curated, clean, and fit for intended registry purpose. Femida alluded to this earlier as it relates to wanting to make sure that the data is clean throughout. If it's not clean data throughout. When I say clean, that means reliable, and you have the ability to draw inferences from that data. Then you're going to be spending time engaging in rework to clean up data that should have been cleaned up going in. Femida, before I go to the next two, do you want to comment on clean data?
No, I think you're good.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay, thank you. And as you've gone through all of that, now you're at the point of developing a research study, including informed consent, research protocol. You want to ensure assiduous compliance with rules and regulations, some of which we've alluded to so far. These you will need to go through them in detail for your activities. And you really want to engage an experienced service provider to help you through this process. And I will, those are the 11 points that we wanted to convey to you. They are, from our standpoint, tried and true process for planning a registry. Femida, do you want to say a few words about the last 3 points?
No, why don't we move to the next slide, Joe? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk now about international rules and regulations. And what I wanted to point out is that an extensive discussion of international rules and regulations is beyond the scope of this webinar because the globe is a big place. So instead, want to talk in terms of big picture, privacy and security. In the United States, there's the HIPAA standard. And in the EU, there's the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation. Those are important to make sure that the registry platform that you select adhere to those standards. Femida had mentioned earlier that there's inter and intra-country cloud-based hosting issues. Can the data about citizens of a particular country go out of the country? Must they remain in the country? What questions can be asked? Those are the sorts of issues that are intended to be addressed here when you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with a rare disease population where the individuals of interest are scattered in different countries. These questions are very, very important. You don't want to trip up all of the good work that you've done because you didn't take into consideration these issues. The next issue, we talked earlier about 21 CFR Part 11. This is about trust and assurance. Can the electronic data be relied upon? There are analogous provisions in other countries as well. And as I said, at least insofar as the Pulse Infoframe platform, we adhere to all of these. We talked also about CDISC and the submission of that data in a format that the regulators can receive. That's the standard that we adhere to. It's a global standard. It's something that is very relevant to think about when you are thinking about an international registry, because you don't want to collect data and then have to do a lot of work to retrofit that data so that it can be submitted to regulators. Okay? And so with that, we'll move on to the next segment, which is registry challenges. And this is a similar format where we're going to talk about the next several slides and then pause and have a joint discussion relating to them. Okay, so you've heard us mention several times that what you want to do here is understand the natural history, and that's the usual course of development of a disease, and very likely have a natural history study, which is following a group of people over time to collect health information in order to understand the condition. And a registry is an ideal mechanism to do this. You heard us mention it earlier. Now, the issue with the rare disease community and rare disease population is that the population really by definition is small. And so you've got to, clinicians may not understand the appropriate ways to diagnose. They may not have appropriate indicators. There may very well be gaps in information. That's why you want a registry to be able to understand what information that you do have, piece it together, bring it together, see where the gaps are, and then address that. Femida, is there anything that you want to say on this slide?
The only thing I was going to refer back to, Joe, thank you, is the CDKL5. You know, it was many years ago, it took up to 8 years to diagnose CDKL5. Today, with some of the testing, newborns can be tested, and those diagnoses can be made a lot faster. So again, you know, because they're small populations, because the opportunity to diagnose is changing so rapidly, but also it's because of the patients who have provided information years and years ago, and clinicians who are so committed to collecting the data and understanding the characterization of the disease, that ultimately new sequencing and was developed. And so essentially, you know, that's really just to illustrate the importance of the community and collecting the right information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
And so the takeaway message from this slide goes to a soundbite that Femida used earlier, and I want to bring it back here, which is endpoints. So once sufficient information is available about the natural history of a condition, then you can begin to think about the endpoints. What is going to be studied to move the science forward and improve the lives of the population affected with this illness? But by this point, you probably will have identified the investigators who are present globally in have a special interest and a commitment to the disease. And as Femida mentioned with CDKL5, you probably will have identified patients as well, and really brought that community of stakeholders together. And as mentioned earlier, because we're dealing with a global community, the rules and regulations differ by country, by province, by locale. Femida, any comments before I go to the next slide?
Nope, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. And so on this slide, the intent of this slide is simply to mention that what you're doing here, if you remember, I think the first slide that Femida presented, she talked about a large amount of data that's siloed, and through the registry, you're able to bring that data together in a very organized manner to help improve the science and the research activities. As mentioned earlier, the real world evidence component of this is a relatively new phenomenon in the research community that is shifting the paradigm and making registries of more value, of more relevance, of more need than ever before to help combat these diseases. Femida, any comments?
No, I think that was really well said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This slide really is intended to let you know that there are many different organizations that are that have registries. So we've taken a look at registries that are activated or maintained by different organizations, whether they be professional societies, whether they be patient advocacy organizations or integrated delivery systems, government entities, and so forth. And it's really all about improved decision making. That's the purpose of the registries, and increasingly they're focused on patient-centered outcomes. And so I wanted to point out that with patient advocacy organizations, there are again, most likely because of financial resource constraints, there are a limited number of groups that have active registries in place together. today. And those registries vary in quality and extensibility of the architecture. One of the things that we had mentioned earlier is that, at least as it relates to the Pulse platform, is you can start small with a contact registry, and you can build as and when your needs require. So I wanted to stop there. Femida, do you have anything that you wanted to add as it relates to this slide?
No, this is really just a slide to illustrate, how people, who are the people who actually build registries and what their interest is. So, and it's publicly available. So that's it, Joe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and so what we've talked about, in addition to the general landscape of registries, is real-world evidence and how a registry can be used to collect real-world data and generate real-world evidence. And that is both here in the United States, but equally important to those of you who are listening in Europe for the AMA as well. Femida, anything you wanted to add to this slide?
Yeah, so really the key takeaway message from this is, look, none of us can do this on our own. And so by being able to bring some of the key people together to help understand what's going to be needed to do a trial, if that's where you're thinking, and ultimately what are the pricing reimbursement agencies looking at in terms of the types of data they're interested in, is an important consideration. And so having those conversations early, and also thinking about the sustainability of registries, because patient advocacy groups are really terrific at raising awareness and bringing in resources. But at some point, as you think about globalization and how you're going to use the data, you have to think about, not have to, but there's an opportunity to bring in private funding, as long as you ensure that the governance structure and the integrity of the purpose of what you're planning is actually not negatively affected. So by that I mean transparency, because what we also see is that sometimes groups that are collecting data end up making agreements with companies and lose some element of the ability to help, manage a trial or to help inform a trial. And ultimately then sometimes some organizations will request that they actually own the data, which is another big issue, because ultimately the data are owned by the patient. So you go in with your eyes open, I think is what we're saying, but also remember that what you want to do is to be able to build registries that are going to be sustainable, and there's so many different ways to actually have public and private funding working together. In fact, a lot of the large European programs, the IMI programs in Europe, are a composition of both public and private funding.
Thank you,
Joe. Thank you.
Thank you. And so now we have a few tips. We have 2 slides. Femida is going to take the first, and I'm going to take the second. Femida, do you want to take this?
Yes, sure. So let's kind of bring it back to where we started. Let's think about how a registry can be used by an advocacy group, patient advocates. So the information that's being collected should be communicated. So very much around, let's say you're contributing data to a registry, how are you going to get information back if something is published? So just make sure that there's communication between the people collecting and managing the data, as well as the people who actually want to be able to share those data. So, we should be sharing information and any new findings. Conduct surveys to collect outcome measures that are relevant in that particular condition. And because there aren't very many disease-specific outcome measurements, often we use surrogate measurements, because new measurements have to be collected that are created that are very specific for a condition, but that doesn't mean we should stop and do nothing. So again, it's about collecting information from a patient's perspective. If there are new trials that are available, use the platform to be able to communicate that through email and SMS, so that people who are interested in participating in a clinical trial can learn more about it and be better informed. And ultimately, we want to be able to affect policy and treatment access. And so collecting the facts, the information, that is going to be relevant for that is very important. And ultimately, data that doesn't provide insights has less value. So let's think about the insights that we can gain. We've spent a lot of time collecting data collectively as multiple organizations. So we want to be able to make sure that we're sharing that and that the information is shareable. In other words, we can create analyses and utilize the data in a way that's meaningful for all of the constituents. And then de-identify the data. There's an aggregation of information. We have to protect the identity of one.
Okay, and so all of you are on a mission, and mission-driven people change the world, and really, to me, are the most interesting people. So we want you to harness that energy. You're likely to be resource constrained, and we're advocating conserving your resources and buying only what you need when you need it. And so we suggested considering starting with a contact registry or contact database. And from there, moving to a discovery and scoping activity would seem to be the logical next step to us. It is the way that many of our registries have commenced. And following that discovery and scoping, the path forward and the timing and the circumstances should all be clarified. And as you're going along, progressing in this journey, you will find opportunities to bring the community together through collaboration and a value add, clean, mineable registry that can be interrogated to achieve your mission. Remember, you don't have the luxury of retooling, so you want to identify a path forward that enables efficiencies and a solution that can grow and evolve as you do and as your registry and the research does. And our advice, don't go it alone, especially with a global registry. Engage an expert to guide you on your journey.
Right. So thank you, Joe. So what we've tried to cover here is really give you a little bit of an idea of real world data, talk a little bit about the regulatory and legislative underpinnings, identify where data comes from and think about the disparity and how we actually harmonize it, the importance of having a collaborative ecosystem in order to enable data sharing, and then what are the most efficient ways to obtain this real world data so we're not duplicating our efforts and tripping over one another, and then ultimately to be able to defend the strategy that we're using, so whether we're pulling data directly from an electronic health record, whether there's data being entered at the source, whether data are coming in from patients. So really to be thoughtful about that. And then ultimately, we've tried to summarize for you the importance of data mapping and why having data mapped in a particular way is really important to ensure high quality real world data.
Okay, thank you, Femida. So Q&A is really the most exciting time of presentation because we get to hear from the audience. And so with that, we want to turn it over to Rick and Philippa to guide us through the Q&A from the audience.
Fantastic. Guys, thank you so much for a really detailed, in-depth presentation. Lots of really helpful tips in there. So I hope everyone, learned something from the time they've spent in here. We've had a really good attendance throughout, so thank you all for sticking with us. Also, some really good questions coming in, so I'm going to dive straight in if that's okay, but please do feel free to keep submitting. I'm just going to go first to a question that came in from Nina. She's interested to find out that if we were to build a comprehensive registry that includes natural history data and clinical data, do you have any suggestions on what you could do to try and engage or entice pharmaceutical companies to participate in some way? So how do you bring pharma, I suppose, into your registry project?
Right, that's a great question, and certainly something that people ask a lot. So the key thing that pharma are interested in are, first of all, do you have data that are ultimately going to be usable for us to help determine whether or not a molecule or a target is going to work? So first of all, if you're working with a reputable vendor who's building your registry, secondly, that you can show them that you've actually gone through the process or will be going through the process of codifying and identifying the natural history and working towards collecting those data again from an audience or patients that you have access to. Those are the three critical features that I would really think about first. So will there be patients? How are you going to codify the data and understand the data for natural history? How are you going to make the data available to them? And are you working with a vendor that they would be comfortable with you working with?
Fantastic. Anything to add to that, Joe? Or?
No, that's good. Thank you. I also know we're a little pressed for time, and I want to make sure that we get as many questions as we can.
We will, don't you worry about that. Another question that's coming from Jess. Interested to know if you have experience in working with the NHS and what challenges you might might foresee or have experienced if you were trying to operate in that UK environment with the NHS's particular structures for holding on to patient data and release of information.
Yeah, so we do have experience working in the NHS. We actually work with partners who are already in the UK. So the challenges would be similar to what I described with global registries. Where is the data being held, and are you properly consenting the patients? So the partners that we work with have an N3 node, which is essentially the mechanism to hold data in the UK. And we also work with cloud provisioning and cloud providers who have been vetted and approved by the UK government. And ultimately, those are the two considerations. And then in terms of the data leaving the UK, as long as the patient is consenting and the data are de-identified and are being used for research, we have not had any challenges. There's some critical pieces. I'm simplifying this, but it's data storage, data availability, where are the data being shared, how are they being shared?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Another question coming from Russell. He's interested to hear a bit about different ontologies that the speakers have encountered and how you've kind of met the challenge of mapping different approaches to record keeping across different registries to get that integration that you've been discussing.
Yeah, so an ontology, again, is the umbrella that helps characterize the disease. In the US, we're using OMOP, which is a global ontology, and in Europe, there's something called SNOMED and SNOMED CT, which is an ontology. The umbrella of OMOP actually includes all of those specific ontologies. And the question is, how do you then harmonize these registries? We also use M-code, which is a different ontology, which is primarily for cancer. So essentially what we do is we look at all of the data dictionary and we create the OMOP mapping, but OMOP is not perfect because it doesn't have all of the variables that are relevant to rare disease. And that's why what we did was we worked with the Office of Rare Disease in the US and actually characterized the common data elements for rare disease. Where there is no structured variable, we have created extensions because OMOP is not perfect and no ontology is perfect. So create extensions and then bring the data in and harmonize it, which is essentially, we're doing some of that work in Europe right now again, across cancer registries.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. A couple of people are throwing in questions that are relating to costs and resource limitations. So Alan, for example, mentioned that a registry is a large investment for patient organisations, and will have difficulty finding the financial outlay to go to this level. And wonder what comments you have following on similar vein to that. A question coming from Kieran asking what the cost is for the kind of full-fledged registry approach that you're kind of been talking about. How much is a full? He's explicitly asked how much is Pulse Infoframe and the most basic and complex route. So obviously you may not want to give specifics at this point, but it'd be interesting to get a gauge of that side of things, I think.
Yeah, so it's hard to give costs out on so feel free to contact us. But the key message that we're giving you is that start with a contact registry. So there are a lot of variables that determine cost. One, if you're working with a vendor like us who actually have a platform, we distribute the costs across many organizations that we work with. So that's a benefit because it's a platform. We start with a contact registry. We then work with you strategically to try to help identify who are potential funders. If you don't have all of the resources, let's both think creatively about how we can work with you to bring in some of those resources, because that kind of ties back to the question about pharma and biotech. We work on a budget with you, and if there are thousands of patients, which there won't be, there's a different cost. If there are patients coming in from different parts of the world and we have to consider some of the cloud provisioning and the data sharing, that changes the cost structure, but we work very closely with advocacy to help them move to the next step and next level. So we're not a large company that has huge overhead. We're a very agile company that has been doing only rare disease and cancer primarily. So we leverage that to benefit everybody. Not the answer you maybe wanted, but feel free to reach out afterwards.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. It's always a tricky one, but I think it's important to touch on it because there are so many groups out there that are really keen to move into this space, but very resource limited, and finding the way in is a key thing for lots of the groups we're working with. Another question that Russell posed earlier ties into the large number of initiatives over the past 10 years that have been through the UK, Europe, and globally that are trying to stimulate and develop more rare disease registries. Lots of those are often incompatible with each other or might be not as connected as you'd like. I suppose partly it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that in general and the approach that's been used, and also what steps you might have taken to try and connect with existing initiatives or initiatives that are coming out going forward, and how easy you can mesh in with that existing ecosystem.
Yeah, so I don't know all of the registries that are in play, but one of the things that we have been doing is working and speaking very actively with the IMI group, which is why I know them very well. The IMI group have both a public and private partnership. Many of the countries and organizations have been collecting their own data in their own data systems. And so what we're doing right now is looking at how we can characterize the data into OMOP and basically provide our platform as a mechanism to bring the data in, but still allow people to function independently. And it was the analogy of the room. So even though a room is a disease, in my analogy, within a room, there are little closets and little rooms, and essentially each group can still maintain control and have a governance structure. So we have been looking at that very actively. In fact, we're just starting a discovery process in Europe, looking across 5 major countries to be able to do that. And so if there's a will, there has to be a way to do it.
Absolutely, fantastic, thank you. Another question came in from Julie, just a specific one, asking if she's understood correctly. You're saying that as well as registries collecting data provided by patients themselves, they can also tie into that data inputted by clinicians actively themselves, so you can get the full spread of registry information.
Absolutely, and CDKL5, for example, started with a contact registry, and then we did the patient registry, which is patient-facing, because identifying the clinical variables and getting consensus from the clinicians is a slightly longer process. So again, we started with one, we moved to the second, and now we're building the clinical registry, which is a much deeper registry, and they all tie together on the same platform.
Fantastic, thank you. Nice little question from Sue. Going back to that perspective of looking at things right from the start, what type of questions would it be ideal to have in that starting contact registry? What are the key bits of data people should be trying to collect?
Sure, so the key bits of data are the demographic information, their name, address, phone number, gender, how to access them, where they live, because that's important. And also then to get a confirmation of their diagnoses or what they think they have. And to do that, we also ask that they upload, if they can, a PDF file or something that characterizes their particular condition. Because then when you're going to invite them into a full registry, you want to make sure that they really do have that condition. And so we did this in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy because there's so many subtypes, and often the patient has the report, and they also have to consent that those information are, obviously they're sharing personal health information and their own demographic information. So it's very simple. A contact registry does not have to have a lot of depth, but it does have to have the key characteristics about condition, demographics primarily, and where they live.
Okay, so kind of again feeding on from that, Tony has mentioned that there seems to be a recommended minimum data set for European registries. He's asking for such a thing in the US, and if those are in accord or if there's discrepancies between them. So
minimal data set is generally, by definition, something that each group identifies on their own, but yes, there is. So a minimal data set is essentially the core elements that you need that provide some level of value, and those are compatible globally. They may not be exactly the same variables because of treatment differences and how data are collected, but they're generally compatible.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, just scanning through the last few questions now. A comment coming from Hayley. Says it's been a very good talk, so thanks for that, Hayley. I'm sure we'll appreciate it. Wondered for Pulse specifically, can the platform be used to capture data within the front end and then analyze it with like infographics at the back end? I'm assuming you have quite a different way of analyzing information behind the scenes.
Yeah, so what we do, so when the data comes in on the front end, we actually have dashboards and analytic tools that are right in the infrastructure for the patient to see, as well as the clinician. They have their own dashboards, patients have their own dashboards, and each of those two groups can download their own personal information to look at it themselves, whatever they're collecting. So yes,
Okay.
there's
Fantastic.
completely built-in dashboards that have key variables available.
Lovely, and I think we'll just wrap up with a final question that's coming from Liz. She's talking about having an ultra-rare condition in which sufferers have other autoimmune conditions that pile up on top of it. So are there any specifics that you should think about when in registries when you're thinking about that build-up of multiple conditions, and how you can track comorbidities, if you like, within the rare disease space?
Yeah, great question. So Castleman's disease is very similar because you have 3 different potential etiologies, so causes, and then there's a whole list of comorbidities or conditions and syndromes that people have. And so by being able to have the data mapped to an ontology or having drop downs so that those comorbidities are being captured is really important. So that you should have the capacity to do that within whichever registry you go with.
Okay, fantastic. Brilliant to answer so many questions so quickly.
It feels like rapid fire.
So it was really impressive for me to thank you for that, and thank you all for some really excellent questions actually throughout the webinar. Really enjoyed it today. I'm going to hand over now to Phil.
Okay.
Yes.
So just a big thank you to Femida and Joe, because that was really informative, and I think it's really going to help a lot of the people who are in the audience today. Just to let you know, this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, and if you would like to find out more about patient registries, we do have an online portal guide which kind of covers all the basics of that's already here, but you can go back and kind of absorb that information whenever you feel like it. And we do have some exciting upcoming events as well in the Find a Cure calendar in the next few months. So next Wednesday, we actually have our Leading a Rare Patient Group workshop, which is really good if you are in a patient group and you're trying to develop confidence in a leadership role, you're trying to see how you fit into that role, or how you fit into other roles and how you can use your skills effectively. We have Julian Stanley coming in to speak, and he's a leadership expert, so he's there to kind of build up your confidence and make your leadership have its biggest impact. So that should be really good, and have quite a personal focus, so that's good as well. And then on the 24th of February, we have our Drug Repurposing for Rare Diseases conference, which is always a good event. And we believe at Find a Cure that drug repurposing is a really good thing for patient groups, because it allows them to really have a voice in the direction that the research and looking for a cure goes. And then also we have some spaces on our Cambridge Half Marathon on the 8th of March. As we are a charity, we do rely partially on fundraising and lovely people like you getting funds for us. So if you would like to take part in that, then you can email at the email on there, or you can visit the Find a Cure website, either way, whatever you want to do. And there's just a contact page as well. If you want to take a picture of that, I'll leave it up for a few seconds, but all the information is available on the website as well. And finally, thank you from all of us at Find a Cure, and I'm sure thank you from Femida and Joe as well for attending today.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to thank Find a Cure. The mission that you're committed to and the work that you're doing is just so very compelling, and thank you for including us in this important mission. Joe, go ahead.
I would echo everything that was said. The only other thing that I would mention is that there are many things that we did not talk about. It was beyond the scope of this presentation, having to do with natural language processing, integration, patient journey mapping. We are more than happy to talk further with you about these things. This was a first conversation, but we hope not the last. So feel free to reach out to us.